what salinity levels were in the Central Delta?
I think, so this is a tricky question, obviously. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that gradient from fresh water, or from brackish to fresh water, really shifted depending on the time of the year and also depending on, whether you'd had a sequence of drought years. And so as far as documentation is concerned, we don't have much documentation that it went farther than, partway up Sherman Island or partway towards where Frank's Tract is today. So the majority of the Central Delta was fresh. And you can see that based on the vegetation as well. You'll see in a slide later, we have these complexes of willows and ferns. Those are species that aren't tolerant of high salinity levels.
Can I summarize what you just said? Saying, yes, we have information, but we're not sure it's complete, absolute, and precise on salinity, where to find it, and what it was.
Right.
I mean, I'm trying to, salinity is something that drives much of the current debate.
True.
You can inform our judgment, but you cannot guarantee us that in 1907, the salinity barrier, according to your evidence, was exactly at this point on a map, correct?
Right. Yes, correct. We can say that it was much more variable than it is today.
In general and over time.
In general and over time. But we can also say that the vegetation is reflective of a freshwater marsh.
Right. There weren't huge waves of salinity going in for long periods of time. We wouldn't see the vegetation signal we see of willows and ferns in the Central Delta. So we can provide some bounds, but yeah, the specifics are complex and not necessarily reflected in our data sources. So yes, thanks.
And important to think about the landscape that mediated that, as Robin mentioned earlier.
That's right. One of the, you guys may think about this, but it's the quantity of water, but I think a lot of what you'll see through this presentation today is it's also what that water was doing in the Delta. Right now it just goes through these channels and keeps going right out. There were all these ways. There were lakes, there were basins, there were forests that were using that water. So there also was greater residence time and probably value, ecological value from the water that went in. Great.
So I wanted to bring up this newspaper article from 1894 that really gets to this idea that gets to the story of just how much things have changed and the fact that people didn't necessarily know the full implications of what they were doing. So they're describing here along the San Joaquin River that historically, in the olden days, the river was very sinuous and much to the frustration of sailors traveling up and down the river. And as a result of all this sinuosity, it was hard for the water to move in and out very quickly with the tides. So the tide range was about 2 feet at Stockton historically. And as a consequence, people could move through at all hours. So the steamboats were able to pass through, that the water was high enough for them to pass through. But once they built these cuts, and those cuts are the dark lines in between connecting up the meander bends in that hand-drawn map, they observed that the water would run out as it would out of a tin pan. And so this, if you can think about this adding up to the whole delta, there's been a substantial transformation in terms of how tides are routed through the system, and that's of great interest to people. And so just to kind of tie that together, that story of this loss of complexity, we've lost about 80% of these blind tidal channels, those networks that branched into the wetlands and terminated. And so you can see today we still have those main channels that form the islands, but we've lost that complexity. And we actually now have more homogenization of the system because of all these connections, these cuts between the meander bends and connections up from one channel to another. And so I mentioned the vegetation community a little bit earlier, and I wanted to point this out here, the important community of the Willow Fern swamp that seems to have been unique to the Central Delta. So again, a way that we can start recognizing and distinguishing between different landscapes, that there are different vegetation patterns. And so here you can see kind of off in the distance beyond, within the tule, within this matrix of emergent wetland, and emergent species, you see these clumps of willows within that community. And these are a couple sources that help support that idea. The map is showing kind of these clumps within their freshwater emergent wetland symbol, and then also the quote there talking about willows growing in bunches within the islands. And that's different from the kind of continuous tule that you would see up in the north part of the delta. And some of these remnants you can still find them on some of the islands within the channel of the San Joaquin today that haven't been reclaimed. And that unique pattern you can still see. So it's important to the character of the Central Delta landscape, and kind of the important point being that you can't assume that all the freshwater tidal wetland that we've mapped is the same. So lastly, I wanted to mention kind of some unique features that were part of the western part of the Central Delta. And so here you see this is a soils map, and the orange colors off towards the eastern side of eastern Contra Costa edge. You can kind of see these small groupings of what they are sandy loams and also sand soils. And they're actually a formation that are kind of poking up within these peaty soils, the blue colors. And this is kind of a conceptual graphic of that. So these Aeolian sand dune deposits, so glacial age dune sands that are poking up above kind of as islands within the tidal wetland. And so these were unique features, even had oaks growing on them. And as you can see from this map, I hope, kind of the speckling signature up here are the sand mounds, and you can see actually people decided to build their houses on these because they were less frequently inundated, and people also used these sand mounds to shore up their levees. So now going to the North Delta, so you can start to see a very different pattern here. You're looking at as it describes where flood basins flank rivers. So you see the wetland lying alongside the natural levees which are built up. Those natural levees, obviously you don't see them in the Central Delta.
North Delta.
Sorry, what?
This is the historic North Delta
exactly.
You're currently describing. Right?
Yeah. Of course, those natural levee features are still part of the Delta today.
I'll tell you what I'm interested in this discussion. The flood basins are not totally, but largely gone from the North Delta because we've channelized the rivers, we're farming the land, so houses are on some. But still, as I understand your report, some physical characteristics that dominated the historic Delta remain today and heavily influence the current status and help us understand what options are available to us to restore the Delta in the future. And one of the things I was having trouble finding in the report is the identification of those things, physical characteristics still remaining that have power and are suggestive for policy choices. So, for example, perhaps it's the relative elevation of the land. In the North Delta, I have no idea. Perhaps it is the presence of a small amount of riparian forest still left in the North Delta. It's that part of the analysis that interests me the most because it takes the historic stuff, acknowledges the change, says you've got some opportunities here, here's what to do with it. And as you talk about it, can you jump back and forth so we can try to draw lessons of what we should learn from the historic evidence in our choices available today? Because I think in the slideshow it doesn't get to that until the last 7 slides, and I think we need to get to it sooner.
Yeah, so I'll try to mention a few of those as I go, and I think in thinking about the Yolo bypass, thinking about the opportunities there, that's something we can keep in mind, thinking about the importance of floods moving through those systems. And you'll see I talk about the connections between this long gradient that you see in the flood basins between this gradient between non-tidal and tidal systems, that's something we can think about more in our contemporary and future delta, that connection between systems that experience regular flooding and then the exchange of the water with perennial wetlands and that export down into the delta, that there's that connection from what's happening up in, say, the Yolo bypass and how that can connect up to, say, our Liberty Island cache slough area. And so there are opportunities there. I think also Robin will talk a bit about the McCormick-Williamson tract and that gradient, again, from tidal in the central delta moving upstream into the riverine system and being able to have that connection and knowing the patterns from the historical system, we can start to imagine new opportunities in our contemporary landscape. So that's kind of a purview or preview, and I will try to indicate that more as I move through these slides quickly, so we can get to some of that, more of that discussion at the end. And this will perhaps help contextualize that a little bit in looking at, so we're looking south here. You can see the city of Sacramento where the American River comes in. And so we're looking at the Yolo Basin on your right, I believe, and the Sacramento Basin on your left. And so these were two southernmost flood basins of a series that extended up the whole of the Sacramento Valley. But they're unique in the sense that they connect up to that tidal landscape. They have their lowermost portions are tidal. And so just to see that, where that falls on our landscape today. So you can see the Sacramento Ship Channel, the Yolo Bypass off to the west, and then Liberty Island down in the southern portion, and that overlaid here. And so that's, again, something to relate to in our contemporary landscape, looking at the Yolo Bypass. What sort of opportunities do we have to have that gradient from a network of tidal channels down in the lower part of the basin that connects up, as it did historically, along this broad gradient with, over a broad distance, 40 miles actually up the Yolo Basin up to where Fremont Weir is today, this broad gradient, this gradual transition along the tidal to fluvial gradient. And then also with these flood basins, an important feature that's, or pattern that's different from the central delta is that these wetlands were relatively isolated in the low water season from the river itself. So when the water levels were low in the river, you might have tides rising and falling about 2 feet at Sacramento, but the wetlands just lying at the back of that forest were non-tidal. And so that again has important implications when we're thinking about different patterns. So in the central delta, those tidal channel patterns that you see in the central delta, that's where you get frequent inundation all year round in comparison to these wetlands here in the Yolo Basin. And I wanted to make the point, of course, that the floods were kind of the important aspect of this North Delta landscape, and the flood basins were part of the flood conveyance capacity of the Sacramento River. The river itself was basically a low flow channel. You can see with the blue line there, that being the capacity of the main stem of the Sacramento River, in comparison to the purple line, which is the capacity, the actual flows, the flood flows that could pass through the Central Valley. So really what's making up that difference there are the flood basins. And so they played a really important role. And in fact, at times, this is a quote from the 1862 flood, at times the water that was coming down through the basins, passing all the way down, from Fremont Weir all the way down through Cache Slough, at the mouth of Cache Slough, could even neutralize the current in the river itself. So these were very important flows. And as Robin alluded to earlier, these basins really played an important role in how water moved through the landscape. And as this quote mentions, they functioned as enormous regulating reservoirs. So they attenuated the flood flows. As you can see from the graph, historically, the blue line, the majority of annual flow came later in the season than it does with unimpaired flows. So that mediating feature of the flood basins was really important in terms of how the water moved through and the timing of it coming through the system. And of course, you can imagine how much it was interacting with the landscape as it moved through.
And just to tie it to the contemporary for a second, those basins, as you suggested, are all still there. They're just not active because of the flood control efforts that we have imposed. So, but farmers know about them. Different crops are grown in those different places. There's different flood risks. That's one of the striking things that I think you're getting, Phil, from this, is that the pattern is actually, the template is still there in large part. We have just modified it so much that we don't actually recognize it. But this helps us see that. And actually local folks actually do know this stuff already in many places.
And just getting to some of the features that you would see in the landscape. So these were basins that were filled with very tall, dense tule, as you can see from the photograph there of them cutting down the tule in the Yolo Basin. And then also, so the features here. So as I mentioned, that transition. So down in the lower part where it's tidal, you see the tidal channels branching off, but they actually diminished and pretty much disappeared as you move up gradient and you move into a system where you see more lakes. For instance, Lake Washington, which is where the turning basin is now for the Sacramento Ship Channel. And just to get a sense of that character, of just how the important role of these lakes in the system, and imagine just how they would have held water through the summer months. This is a great account from a duck hunter in around about the 1850s, talking about trying to access a lake out in the middle of this impenetrable tule swamp of immense extent, and finding this lake that was relatively shallow, had a lot of complex edges to it, and then also this duck hunter spoke a bit about the vegetation that was growing in the lake itself, being thickly covered with lily pads. And so that gives us a sense of what the landscape was like on the ground. He's out here in the wintertime. And then you can imagine as the seasons wore on, or during the dry season, these slowly dried out and became more isolated from the river system itself. But we have quotes about fish knowing to occupy the lakes in the high water season and then exit out into the river channels before they became isolated. And then in thinking about the riparian forest, I think today we often, riparian forest is something that we think about restoring, but in terms of its pattern and how it was connected to the marshes, I think that's an important story to think about more. And so, you have historically, as you're traveling up the Sacramento River, these screens of vines along the river channel. And then as you part through those vines and go across these natural levees, these elevated lands that were built up by the sediments coming down from the Sacramento River, you pass through this dense forest with sycamores and oaks, and then pass in some places over half a mile before you would reach the tule at the back of the natural levees. So that sort of connection, that pattern, and having the overflow processes of the river that build these natural levees and support the floodplain forest is, again, something we're thinking about. And you can see that in this early photograph. I wanted to point out that these natural levees were, elevated lands. The water table was lower, and so it was a great location to put your orchard, as you can see on this natural levee. And then you can see really clearly where the artificial levee has been built up along the Sacramento River. And you actually still see that pattern today. So again, that reflection of the natural levee still being a part of our landscape. It's still where you see the orchards growing today in comparison to your asparagus and other crops that can handle the wetter soils at the back. So now to jump to the South Delta and again look at these differences in what you see. So here I'm talking about where these floodplains of the river meet the tides. So you don't have these large basins that are relatively isolated in the dry season like you see in the North Delta. You have lots of side channel habitats. Side channels that branch off the main stem and then connect up a little ways downstream. And then with the dry season and this topographic complexity, you see a lot of local scale patterns in the habitats. So this was a wet landscape as well, given the snowmelt signature of the San Joaquin flows. The South Delta was actually in the hottest part of the year. It was really at its wettest. As you can see from this early Spanish explorer, he's remarking that this area in the South Delta was that the high water season was in the summer. And so to get a sense of kind of the complexity of that landscape, what it would have been like, this was really a dynamic riverine, meandering system that created lots of side channels, oxbows, kind of many of the off-channel habitats that we see as important in terms of riverine restoration today. And you can see through time, looking at these maps, the meander bend towards the top slowly being captured, and today it's no longer part of the main river. So that was, a lot of these features were what you saw as you move through the landscape. And I wanted to bring up this quote from a gold miner. He's traveling up to the mines, trying to cross through the South Delta, actually at the most downstream point that was possible to cross, where I-5 is today. And so here he's describing having to pass through lots of ponds and swamps and sloughs before he actually gets to the river, where he's able to find some tules bunched together that he can use, or that they can use to travel across the river. And then finally, in the last part there, as after they'd crossed the river, reaching a lagoon where an American had perished a few days before, so certainly indicating that just how treacherous this area was. Many early accounts describe how difficult it was to pass through the system in the early summer months. You really had to wait until late in the season before you could move through.